I oversee $500 million in education grants and always visit schools. Undercover to see who really deserves the money. The PTA president. At my daughter's school blocked me from their meeting because my khakis weren't designer enough. I oversee $500 million in education grants for schools, and instead of announcing myself, I always visit Undercover to see who really deserves the money, not the show they put on for funders. Nothing could have prepared me for the school my daughter went to. Lincoln Elementary's PTA board meeting, where I met the Karen mom who controlled everything. The one other parents warned me would eat a single dad alive. Excuse me, the president blocked the door with her designer bag, looking at my coffee-stained khakis. This meeting is about, complicated financial stuff. I tried to squeeze past her, but she actually stepped sideways to block me completely. The other board members were already seated around the conference table with their matching Starbucks cups and color-coded binders. I reached for the budget papers sitting on the table, and the vice president slid them away before my fingers could touch them. My jaw tightened. The treasurer looked at the secretary and mouthed, "He just doesn't get it," while shaking her head. The president finally let me in, but the only empty chair had designer purses blocking it on both sides. They made no move to clear the seat, so I stood awkwardly by the wall. Through the window, I could see one of them taking photos of my humble Toyota Corolla parked between their Mercedes and BMWs. The treasurer pulled up something on her laptop and announced, "Your apartment address isn't even in the good school zone." The secretary immediately jumped in, saying there was a new $500 emergency assessment fee that was due today. She actually pulled out a square reader and held it toward me. I forced myself to breathe slowly. The president wrinkled her nose at my Target khakis and stage whispered something about maintaining standards. "This is really more of a mom thing," the vice president said when I tried to join their circle around the grant application. They physically closed ranks with their backs to me. When I walked around to the other side and tried again, the president actually put her hand on my chest and pushed me back. Not hard, but firm enough to make her point. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. This was the same woman who probably taught her kids it was wrong to put hands on people. Nice. The treasurer looked me up and down, then said, "Foundations want families that look good in photos. Wholesome, American, like us." She held eye contact while emphasizing each word. The secretary mentioned something about cultural fit while staring directly at my skin. The president suggested I might be more comfortable with a maintenance staff meeting since Miguel and the others met on Thursdays, and I'd fit right in. The same Miguel whose son I'd just approved a full scholarship for. The attacks shifted to my daughter Emma when the president pulled up pickup line photos on her phone. My stomach churned when she zoomed in on Emma's mismatched socks and passed the phone around the table. The treasurer grabbed her own phone and took a photo of Emma's lunchbox from yesterday, showing the sandwiches in Ziploc bags instead of bento boxes. "No wonder Emma struggles without a mother's touch," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. I bit down so hard I tasted blood. Without asking, she grabbed Emma's backpack from where I'd set it down and dumped the entire contents on the conference table. Homework folders, pencil case, library books, and snacks scattered across the polished wood. She held up each item for inspection, while the others shook their heads. The secretary handed me a stack of parenting brochures about children of divorce and the warning signs of neglect. The vice president actually grabbed my phone from the table and asked why I didn't have appropriate monitoring apps for a single dad. She was scrolling through my home screen when I took it back. The president pulled up statistics on her laptop about single-parent household crime rates and turned the screen toward me. "Studies show kids like yours end up, well, that's why we need this grant money for intervention programs." My straight-A daughter apparently needed intervention. She called another parent over from the hallway and pointed at Emma's snack. "Look at this." He packed her a gas station honey bun for a snack. Every word about Emma made my vision blur at the edges. Suddenly, the conference room door burst open and Principal Matthews rushed in out of breath. "Mr. Hernandez, I'm so sorry I'm late for our meeting about the grant review." She stopped mid-stride, taking in the scene with me standing apart from the circle of PTA board members and Emma's belongings scattered across the table. Her face went pale. "Oh no." "From the Morrison Foundation," the principal stammered. "Mr. Hernandez is the person who decides which schools get the $500,000 STEM grant. He's here doing the culture assessment, seeing if we deserve the money." The mom who'd pushed me back physically stumbled backward. "He decides?" someone whispered. The color drained from every face around the table. The president's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The vice president dropped her color-coded binder, papers scattering across the floor. The treasurer's laptop slipped from her fingers, catching it just before it hit the table. I stood there, watching them scramble to process this information. The same women who'd been treating me like dirt 30 seconds ago now looked like they'd seen a ghost. The secretary fumbled with her square reader, shoving it back into her purse with shaking hands. Principal Matthews moved quickly, gathering Emma's belongings from the table and carefully placing them back in her backpack. Her hands trembled as she zipped it closed and handed it to me. The PTA president finally found her voice, though it came out as a squeak. "Mr. Hernandez, we had no idea. We thought." She smoothed her designer dress with nervous hands, then reached for her coffee cup, nearly knocking it over. The vice president bent down to collect her scattered papers, her face burning red. When she stood up, she couldn't meet my eyes. The treasurer closed her laptop with a soft click and pushed it to the side. The secretary clutched her stack of parenting brochures to her chest like a shield. I picked up Emma's backpack and slung it over my shoulder. Principal Matthews stepped closer to me, creating a subtle barrier between me and the board members. Her professional smile looked strained at the edges. The president cleared her throat and attempted to rearrange her face into something resembling warmth. She moved her designer bag from the chair it had been blocking and gestured toward it with both hands. The other board members suddenly found urgent reasons to shift their purses and make space. "Please, Mr. Hernandez, won't you sit down? We were just about to discuss the grant application." Her voice pitched higher with each word. The treasurer opened her laptop again, fingers flying across across the keyboard. I have all our financial records right here. Everything is transparent and above board, of course. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the air conditioning. The secretary shuffled through her papers, pulling out what looked like achievement certificates and test scores. Her hands shook so badly that several sheets fluttered to the floor. The vice president rushed to help her pick them up, both women crouching awkwardly in their pencil skirts. Principal Matthews maintained her position between me and the board. Mr. Hernandez has been observing our school culture for the past week. He's very thorough in his assessments. Her tone carried a warning that the board members couldn't miss. The president's smile stretched wider, looking almost painful. Of course, we absolutely support thorough assessments. In fact, we were just discussing how to better serve all our families, weren't we? She looked around the table for support. The other board members nodded vigorously. The treasurer pulled up a new screen on her laptop. Look, here's our diversity and inclusion initiative. We've been working so hard on making sure every family feels welcome. The irony seemed lost on her. I shifted Emma's backpack to my other shoulder. The weight of their stares pressed against me as they waited for my response. The secretary quietly slid the parenting brochures off the table and into her tote bag. The vice president straightened her papers into a perfect stack, aligning the edges with obsessive precision. Actually, Principal Matthews interjected, Mr. Hernandez and I need to continue our tour of the facilities. We have a tight schedule today. She moved toward the door, clearly expecting me to follow. The president jumped up from her chair. Oh, but surely Mr. Hernandez would like to hear about our wonderful programs. We have so many innovative ideas for the STEM grant money. Desperation crept into her voice. The treasurer stood too, laptop clutched to her chest. Yes, we've already drafted a preliminary budget. Every penny would go directly to benefit the students, especially those from diverse backgrounds. She stumbled over the last words. The secretary and vice president flanked them, creating a semicircle between me and the door. Their matching Starbucks cups sat forgotten on the table, ice melting and condensation pooling on the polished wood. Principal Matthews checked her watch pointedly. The second grade classes will be starting their science block in 10 minutes. Mr. Hernandez specifically requested to observe authentic classroom experiences. She opened the door and held it. I walked toward the exit, feeling their eyes boring into my back. The president's heels clicked rapidly on the floor as she hurried after us. Mr. Hernandez, please, if we could just have 5 more minutes to explain our vision. The other board members crowded behind her in the doorway. The treasurer called out, we have letters of support from prominent community members. Why does the PTA president need to physically block someone from entering a public school meeting? Her hand on his chest feels like something deeper than just protecting financial discussions. The secretary added, and testimonials from families about how much the school means to them. Principal Matthews guided me down the hallway, maintaining a brisk pace. Behind us, the PTA board members huddled in the conference room doorway, their whispered arguments carrying down the corridor. Through the walls, I could hear chairs scraping and voices rising as they turned on each other. We rounded the corner, and Principal Matthews finally slowed her pace. She glanced back to ensure we weren't being followed, then let out a long breath. Her professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing exhaustion underneath. The hallway walls displayed student artwork, bright construction paper butterflies and hand-traced turkeys, each one carefully labeled with a child's name and grade. Emma's name appeared on a solar system project, planets cut from magazines and glued in careful order. Principal Matthews paused at a classroom door, peering through the small window before moving on. The muffled sounds of children reciting multiplication tables drifted into the hallway. A teacher's encouraging voice followed, praising their effort. We passed the library where volunteer parents sorted books onto carts. They looked up as we walked by, curiosity plain on their faces. News traveled fast in elementary schools, and I could already see them leaning together to whisper once we'd passed. The principal led me to a quieter wing of the building. Trophy cases lined the walls, displaying academic achievement awards and science fair ribbons. She stopped at a bench beneath a bulletin board covered in student photos from the recent fall festival. Mr. Hernandez, I need you to know that those women don't represent our entire school community. She kept her voice low, glancing around to ensure we were alone. Many of our families and teachers work incredibly hard with limited resources. I set Emma's backpack on the bench beside me. Through a nearby window, I could see the playground where kindergartners climbed on monkey bars and pushed each other on swings. Their happy shrieks carried faintly through the glass. Principal Matthews pulled out her phone and scrolled through emails. I've been documenting concerns about the PTA board's exclusionary practices for months. Other parents have complained, but she trailed off, shaking her head. A bell rang, and classroom doors opened in sequence. Children poured into the hallways in organized lines, teachers guiding them with practiced efficiency. I spotted Emma's class heading toward the cafeteria, her friend Maria walking beside her. Emma hadn't seen me yet. She chatted animatedly with Maria, gesturing with her hands to illustrate whatever story she was telling. Her mismatched socks peeked out from beneath her jeans, one striped and one polka-dotted. The sight made my chest tight. Principal Matthews followed my gaze. Emma's teacher, Mrs. Fuller, specifically requested to speak with you if possible. She's been concerned about some recent incidents. Her careful tone suggested these incidents weren't academic. A group of mothers walked past, several carrying volunteer badges and supplies for classroom activities. They slowed when they saw us, exchanging meaningful looks. One whispered something to another, who gasped and covered her mouth. The principal's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and her expression darkened. The PTA president is already sending emails to the district office. She's claiming there's been a misunderstanding and requesting an emergency meeting. She showed me the screen. Through the cafeteria windows, I watched Emma sit down with her lunch. She pulled out her sandwich in its Ziploc bag, seemingly unbothered by the fancy bento boxes around her. Maria shared her apple slices, and Emma offered half her honey bun in return. More footsteps echoed down the hallway. The vice president appeared around the corner, walking quickly but trying to appear casual. She spotted us and slowed, pretending to study a display of student poetry on the wall. Principal Matthews stood. Let's continue to my office. We can discuss the actual grant application there. She emphasized actual, just enough for the vice president to hear. As we walked away, I heard rapid texting behind us. The vice president's heels clicked faster, following at what she probably thought was a discreet distance. Other classroom doors opened and more teachers emerged, some nodding respectfully as we passed. The main office buzzed with typical school day chaos. The secretary fielded phone calls while the nurse applied a bandage to a scraped knee. Parents signed children in and out, the attendance clipboard passing from hand to hand. Principal Matthews' office was a haven of relative quiet. Student drawings covered one wall, and a well-worn reading chair sat in the corner next to overflowing bookshelves. She closed the door firmly and gestured to a seat across from her desk. The Morrison Foundation support would transform our STEM program, she began, pulling out a binder that looked nothing like the PTA's color-coded versions. This one was stuffed with papers, sticky notes marking different sections. Our teachers have been making do with outdated equipment and limited supplies. She opened to a page showing photos of the current science lab. Ancient microscopes sat on chipped tables, a periodic table poster curled at the edges, held up with yellowing tape. The computer lab photos were even worse, showing machines that belonged in a technology museum. Mrs. Fuller and the other teachers pooled their own money to buy basic supplies this year. She flipped to another section showing receipts and teacher testimonials. The PTA board allocated funds for a new coffee machine for their meeting room instead. Through the office window, I could see the vice president hovering near the secretary's desk, pretending to look at attendance forms while obviously trying to eavesdrop. The secretary pointedly turned up her radio, drowning out our conversation with classical music. Principal Matthews's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and declined it. It immediately rang again and again. She finally turned it to silent, but I could see the screen lighting up with message after message. They're panicking, she said simply. The board has controlled grant applications and funding decisions for 3 years. They've turned this school into their personal kingdom. She pulled out another folder, this one marked confidential. I shouldn't show you this, but she opened it to reveal emails and meeting minutes. My stomach turned as I read through their past decisions. Fundraiser money diverted to vanity projects. Supply closets locked with resources the board deemed unnecessary. Teacher requests denied while the PTA meeting room got a renovation. A knock at the door interrupted us. The secretary poked her head in. Principal Matthews, there's an urgent call from the district superintendent, and the PTA president is in the main office insisting on speaking with you both. Through the doorway, I could see the president pacing near the front desk, her phone pressed to her ear. Her free hand gestured wildly as she spoke to whoever was on the other line. The treasurer and secretary flanked her, both typing furiously on their phones. Principal Matthews straightened her shoulders. Tell the superintendent I'll call back in 30 minutes, and please inform the PTA president that I'm in a closed-door meeting that cannot be interrupted. Her tone brooked no argument. The secretary nodded and closed the door. We could hear raised voices from the main office, muffled but clearly agitated. The president's voice rose above the others, something about protocols and proper channels. I thought about Emma in the cafeteria, happily trading snacks with Maria, oblivious to the storm brewing in the administrative offices. She didn't know that her mismatched socks and Ziploc bags had been photographed and judged. She didn't know that her gas station honey bun had been evidence of my supposed parental failings. Principal Matthews seemed to read my thoughts. Emma is a remarkable student. Her teachers consistently praise her kindness, creativity, and academic excellence. She pulled out a different folder, this one decorated with star stickers. These are notes from her teachers over the years. Not a single concern except, she paused, choosing her words carefully, except recently, some mothers have been making comments about her lunches, her clothes, whether she has the right supplies. Emma asked Mrs. Fuller why she couldn't have a mom to make her lunch pretty like the other kids. My hands clenched in my lap. Principal Matthews continued. Mrs. Fuller handled it beautifully, but she wanted me to know. This isn't the first time the PTA board's attitudes have filtered down to affect students. Another knock, more insistent this time. The secretary's voice carried through the door. Principal Matthews, I'm so sorry, but the superintendent is calling on line 2 and says it's urgent. The PTA president is threatening to go to the school board. Principal Matthews looked at me. Mr. Hernandez, I understand you have a process for these assessments, but I want you to know that this school is more than those 4 women and their designer bags. We have teachers spending their own money, parents working multiple jobs to support their children's education, and students like Emma who deserve every opportunity we can give them. She stood, smoothing her skirt. I need to take this call, but please, observe our classrooms, talk to our teachers, see the real Lincoln Elementary, not the version the PTA board wants to sell you. As she reached for the door, her desk phone rang again. The display showed the superintendent's direct line. Through the window, I could see the PTA president now surrounded by other parents she'd apparently summoned. The crowd in the main office was growing. Principal Matthews deserves hazard pay for dealing with PTA moms who treat elementary school like their personal reality show. Those trophy cases must be jealous of all the drama happening in real time. Principal Matthews answered the superintendent's call while I stepped into the hallway. The PTA president immediately broke away from her group and rushed toward me, her heels clicking frantically on the linoleum. Behind her, the treasurer and secretary followed like synchronized swimmers, their faces arranged in identical expressions of desperate friendliness. I walked toward the second-grade wing, needing to see actual classrooms in action. The president caught up, slightly out of breath, and positioned herself directly in my path. Her perfume hit me like a wall of flowers. She clasped her hands together and tilted her head in what she probably thought was an endearing angle. The treasurer appeared at my left side, laptop balanced on her forearm. She pulled up spreadsheets and charts, angling the screen toward me while walking sideways. The secretary materialized on my right, shuffling through a stack of papers she'd somehow produced. They formed a moving barrier around me, herding me away from the classrooms. I stopped abruptly. They stumbled into each each other, the secretary's papers flying everywhere. As they scrambled to collect them, I stepped around their huddle and continued toward Mrs. Fuller's classroom. Through the door's window, I could see Emma at her desk, hand raised eagerly as Mrs. Fuller wrote math problems on the board. The president's hand landed on my arm. I looked down at her manicured fingers gripping my sleeve, then up at her face. She quickly released me but stepped closer, lowering her voice to share something confidential about the school's needs. The treasurer nodded enthusiastically, adding details about their innovative programs. The secretary pulled out her phone to show photos of past events. Mrs. Fuller noticed us through the window and moved toward the door. The president immediately stepped between us, suggesting we visit the new computer lab first. The treasurer agreed loudly, already walking in that direction. The secretary grabbed my elbow to guide me along. I planted my feet. Mrs. Fuller opened her classroom door, and 25 second graders turned to look at us. Emma's face lit up when she saw me, then quickly shifted to confusion at the crowd of women surrounding me. Mrs. Fuller invited me to observe the lesson, but the president insisted the students shouldn't be disrupted. The treasurer mentioned the time sensitivity of reviewing their grant proposal. The secretary waved her phone, showing messages from other board members waiting to meet with me. Behind them, I watched Emma's smile fade as she turned back to her desk. Mrs. Fuller gave me a meaningful look before closing her door. The women guided me toward the computer lab, talking over each other about technology initiatives and digital learning platforms. The lab door was locked. The president fumbled with keys while the treasurer explained how new equipment would benefit students. The secretary listed statistics about improved test scores with better technology. Inside, ancient computers lined dusty tables. Several monitors displayed error messages. One tower's side panel was held on with duct tape. The president quickly steered me toward the newer machines in the corner, all three of them. The treasurer opened her laptop to show artist renderings of their proposed upgrades. The secretary started taking photos of me examining the equipment. I moved to test one of the older computers. It wheezed to life, taking 4 minutes to load the desktop. The president assured me these machines were scheduled for replacement. The treasurer calculated costs on her phone. The secretary mentioned that some families had offered to donate their old computers. A group of 5th graders entered for their computer class. Their teacher apologized for interrupting and started directing students to share machines since only half worked. The president ushered me out quickly, explaining that scheduling conflicts sometimes happened. The treasurer suggested we review their technology budget in the conference room. The secretary was already texting someone. In the hallway, I noticed a supply closet with a padlock. Through the small window, I could see boxes of new materials stacked to the ceiling. The president saw me looking and quickly explained those were special supplies for advanced programs. The treasurer added that they had to be carefully distributed. The secretary stood directly in front of the door. I asked to see the distribution records. The president's smile tightened as she promised to email them later. The treasurer suddenly remembered an urgent budget item to discuss. The secretary received a conveniently timed phone call requiring immediate attention. They huddled together, whispering frantically while I examined the locked closet more closely. Principal Matthews appeared in the hallway, having finished her call. The PTA women immediately surrounded her, talking rapidly about procedures and protocols. She listened patiently, then informed them she needed to continue Mr. Hernandez's tour personally. The president protested about their scheduled presentation. The treasurer mentioned the time they'd invested in preparing materials. The secretary pulled out a printed agenda. Matthews firmly guided me away from them, but they followed at a distance. We visited the library, where outdated books filled sagging shelves. The librarian, Mrs. Garcia, showed me her wish list of needed materials, while the PTA board hovered in the doorway. The president kept checking her phone and frowning. The treasurer typed furiously on her laptop. The secretary made call after call. In the art room, students shared broken crayons and dried-out markers. The teacher had bought supplies with her own money, receipts carefully saved in a folder. The president appeared beside me to explain their arts enrichment program, which seemed to exist only in her description. The treasurer showed me photos from last year's art show. The secretary mentioned corporate sponsorship opportunities. We moved to the music room, where children practiced on a piano missing several keys. The PTA board clustered in the corner, having an intense whispered conference. The president kept glancing at me while gesturing emphatically. The treasurer showed something on her laptop screen that made the secretary gasp. They broke apart when they noticed me watching. Lunchtime arrived, and I headed to the cafeteria. Emma waved from her table, and I waved back. The president immediately suggested we eat in the conference room to discuss the grant application. The treasurer mentioned she'd ordered lunch from an upscale restaurant. The secretary was already walking toward the main office. I sat at an empty cafeteria table instead. The lunch ladies recognized me from previous visits and smiled warmly. The president reluctantly sat across from me, her designer suit out of place among the bright plastic chairs. The treasurer and secretary flanked her, looking deeply uncomfortable. Emma approached our table with her lunch tray. The president's expression shifted to something calculating as Emma asked if she could sit with us. Before I could answer, the president suggested Emma might be more comfortable with her friends. The treasurer mentioned something about professional boundaries. The secretary pointed out an empty seat at Emma's usual table. Emma's face fell, but she nodded and walked away. My jaw clenched as I watched her sit back down with Maria. The president immediately launched into a speech about the grant money's potential impact. The treasurer pulled out printed projections. The secretary distributed glossy brochures they'd apparently had professionally made. After lunch, Principal Matthews found me surrounded by PTA board members in the hallway. She announced it was time to visit the special education classrooms. The president's face went pale. The treasurer quickly interjected that those rooms were being cleaned. The secretary mentioned something about confidentiality concerns. Matthews led me there anyway. The special education teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, welcomed us warmly. His classroom was the only one with new supplies, adaptive equipment, and updated technology. The president stayed in the doorway, lips pressed laughed thin. The treasurer and secretary whispered urgently behind her. Mr. Rodriguez explained how he'd written grants himself to fund his classroom. The PTA had allocated nothing for special education in 3 years. The president interrupted to clarify that funds were distributed based on student numbers. The treasurer added something about fiduciary responsibility. The secretary mentioned legal compliance. As we left, I noticed Emma's class lining up for recess. The president saw my glance and immediately steered me toward the gymnasium. The treasurer explained their physical education initiatives. The secretary pulled up statistics about childhood obesity. They kept me moving away from the playground. In the gym, basketball hoops hung at different heights. One backboard cracked down the middle. The PE teacher used equipment donated by parents, most of it secondhand. The president talked over him about their wellness programs. The treasurer calculated potential improvements. The secretary took more photos. We returned to the main office to find a crowd of parents waiting. The president had apparently sent messages during lunch, summoning supporters. They held signs thanking the PTA board for their dedication. Several approached me with rehearsed speeches about the board's wonderful work. The treasurer smiled triumphantly. The secretary started a video recording. Principal Matthews' assistant handed her a note. She read it and frowned, then showed it to me. The district office had received multiple calls about my visit, all from PTA board members or their associates. The president pretended to look surprised. The treasurer expressed concern about following proper channels. The secretary mentioned transparency protocols. This principal definitely knows what's going on with that locked supply closet full of materials while kids share broken crayons. The way the PTA board physically blocks access to certain areas tells me they're hiding something pretty big here. I asked to see the PTA's financial records from the past 3 years. The president's smile became strained as she promised to compile them. The treasurer suddenly discovered a calculation error requiring immediate attention. The secretary received another urgent phone call. They retreated to the conference room for another emergency meeting. While they huddled, I visited more classrooms. Teachers shared stories of denied requests, locked supplies, and fundraisers that never benefited their students. Several mentioned fear of retaliation if they complained. The pattern became clearer with each conversation. The PTA board emerged from their meeting with renewed determination. The president announced they'd prepared a comprehensive presentation. The treasurer had created new spreadsheets. The secretary had printed bound copies of their proposal. They herded me back toward the conference room. Inside, they'd set up a projector and arranged chairs theater style. The president stood at the front with a laser pointer. The treasurer controlled the slides from her laptop. The secretary distributed information packets to the assembled parents they'd summoned. The presentation was slick, professional, and completely detached from the reality I'd observed. They showed stock photos of diverse, smiling children using state-of-the-art equipment. The treasurer's budget projections assumed costs far below market rates. The secretary's timeline ignored the months of bureaucracy they'd created. When I asked specific questions about fund allocation, the president deflected to future possibilities. The treasurer promised detailed reports later. The secretary mentioned their excellent track record, though no evidence supported this claim. The other parents nodded along, clearly afraid to dissent. After an hour, I stood to leave. The president blocked the door, insisting they hadn't covered everything. The treasurer mentioned additional materials to review. The secretary pulled out another binder. I moved past them, but they followed me into the hallway. Emma's class was returning from recess. She walked slowly, separate from the group. Her teacher guided her back in line, but I caught the hurt look on her face. The president noticed my attention and immediately began talking about their anti-bullying initiatives. The treasurer showed me statistics on their website. The secretary suggested we discuss student welfare programs. I headed for Principal Matthews' office. The PTA board tried to intercept me, but Matthews appeared and firmly escorted me inside. Through the window, I could see them pacing outside, making phone calls and gesturing wildly. The secretary actually pressed her ear against the door. Matthews showed me more documentation of the board's financial mismanagement. Purchase orders for unnecessary conference room upgrades while classrooms lacked basic supplies. Vendor contracts awarded to board members' friends at inflated prices. Fundraiser proceeds diverted to administrative costs that seemed to benefit only the board. A knock interrupted us. The school counselor entered with Emma. My daughter's eyes were red, and she clutched a crumpled tissue. The counselor explained that some girls had been making comments about Emma's lunch and clothes. The ringleader's mother was on the PTA board. Emma climbed into my lap, something she rarely did at school. Through the window, I saw the president watching us with narrowed eyes. She typed rapidly on her phone. Within minutes, the treasurer and secretary joined her, all three staring through the window. The counselor shared her concerns about a pattern of exclusion affecting children whose parents weren't part of the PTA's inner circle. Birthday party invitations distributed selectively. Group projects arranged to isolate certain students. Subtle but persistent social engineering that started with the parents and trickled down to their children. Emma whispered that she just wanted to fit in. My heart broke as she asked if we could buy fancier lunch containers. The counselor gently explained that the problem wasn't with Emma's lunch. Through the window, the PTA board continued their surveillance, occasionally pointing and whispering. After Emma returned to class, I spent time reviewing the school's actual needs with Principal Matthews. The list was extensive and heartbreaking. Basic supplies, building repairs, updated textbooks, playground equipment, technology from this century. All while the PTA board sat on funds meant for these purposes. The president knocked and entered without waiting for permission. She expressed concern about Emma's emotional well-being, suggesting that children of single parents often needed extra support. The treasurer offered parenting resources. The secretary mentioned counseling programs. Their false sympathy made my skin crawl. Matthews asked them to leave, but they insisted on discussing the grant timeline. The treasurer pulled out her laptop again. The secretary started another recording. They talked over each other about deadlines and requirements, creating chaos designed to overwhelm and confuse. I finally stood stood and walked out, leaving them mid-sentence. They scrambled to follow, the president's heels clicking rapidly behind me. The treasurer clutched her laptop to her chest. The secretary dropped her phone in her haste to keep up. In the parking lot, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper, an anonymous warning about making enemies of powerful people. The president appeared beside my car, claiming she'd seen some teenagers near the vehicles earlier. The treasurer mentioned vandalism concerns. The secretary offered to review security footage. As I drove away, I could see them in my rearview mirror, standing in a tight circle in the parking lot. Their phones were out, no doubt coordinating their next move. The battle for Lincoln Elementary's future had only just begun, and Emma was caught in the crossfire. That evening, my phone buzzed with emails from PTA board members and their supporters. Concerns about my assessment process, questions about my qualifications, suggestions that someone else might be better suited to evaluate their grant application. The campaign to discredit me had officially started. Emma was quiet during dinner, pushing food around her plate. When I asked about her day, she mentioned that several classmates had suddenly canceled playdate plans. Their mothers had called with vague excuses about scheduling conflicts. The social isolation was beginning, orchestrated by women who claimed to care about children's welfare. I tucked Emma into bed, promising her that things would get better. She asked if she'd done something wrong to make the other kids not like her. I held her until she fell asleep, fury building in my chest at adults who would use children as pawns in their power games. Back at my laptop, I reviewed the notes from my visit. The contrast between the PTA's presentation and the school's reality was stark. They'd created an elaborate facade to hide their mismanagement and self-serving decisions. But facades crack under pressure, and I intended to apply plenty. My phone rang. Principal Matthews' name appeared on the screen. She spoke quickly, warning me that the PTA president had called an emergency board meeting for the next morning. They were planning to file a formal complaint about my assessment process. The secretary had already drafted a letter to the Morrison Foundation, questioning my objectivity. I thanked Matthews for the warning and ended the call. Outside, a car drove slowly past my apartment building. It might have been nothing, or it might have been one of the PTA board members checking where I lived. Their desperation was escalating, and desperate people make dangerous choices. The next morning arrived too quickly. I dropped Emma at school, noticing how other parents seemed to avoid eye contact. The PTA's whisper campaign was spreading. Emma hugged me extra tight before joining her class, and I watched until she disappeared inside. The emergency board meeting was already in session when I arrived. Through the conference room window, I could see the president gesturing dramatically while other board members nodded. Parents filled the seats, some looking uncomfortable but afraid to speak up. The treasurer had her laptop connected to a projector, displaying slides about proper grant evaluation procedures. I entered without knocking. The room fell silent as heads turned toward me. The president's face flushed, but she quickly recovered her composure. She announced that they were discussing concerns about the assessment process. The treasurer clicked to a slide showing Morrison Foundation guidelines. The secretary read from prepared notes about transparency and fairness. Several parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I recognized some from yesterday's staged support demonstration, but their enthusiasm had dimmed. One mother kept glancing between me and the board, conflict clear on her face. Another fidgeted with his phone, avoiding everyone's eyes. The president invited me to address their concerns. I remained standing, letting silence fill the room. The treasurer's fingers hovered over her keyboard. The secretary's pen trembled slightly as she waited to take notes. Behind them, more parents filtered in, drawn by curiosity or summons. Instead of defending myself, I asked about the locked supply closet. The president's smile faltered as she explained again about special programs. I asked for specifics. The treasurer mentioned inventory management. I requested documentation. The secretary promised to email it later. I insisted on seeing it now. The room grew tense as board members exchanged glances. Parents began whispering among themselves. One father raised his hand to ask why supplies were locked away when his daughter's class needed materials. The president silenced him with a look, but others started murmuring agreement. The PTA board just went from helicopter parents to full surveillance drone mode, complete with parking lot huddles and window stalking. Matthew's office has become ground zero for the world's pettiest Cold War. I pulled out my phone and showed photos I'd taken of the computer lab, the broken gym equipment, the outdated textbooks. Parents leaned forward to see. The president tried to explain each image away. The treasurer quoted budget constraints. The secretary mentioned district policies. Their explanations rang hollow in the crowded room. A mother I hadn't seen before stood up. She introduced herself as Catherine Fuller, a new parent who'd recently moved to the district. She asked why her son's teacher had to buy supplies with personal funds when the PTA had money for conference room renovations. The president's response about priorities satisfied no one. More parents began speaking up. Stories of denied requests, dismissed concerns, and children excluded from activities because their families weren't part of the inner circle. The treasurer tried to regain control by showing financial spreadsheets. The secretary called for order. The president's smile became increasingly strained. I remained silent, letting the community find its voice. Years of frustration bubbled to the surface as parents realized they weren't alone in their experiences. The board members looked increasingly cornered as their carefully maintained control began to crack. The vice president, who'd been silent until now, suddenly stood. She announced she had something to share. The president shot her a warning look, but she pulled out a folder. Inside were emails between board members discussing how to hide certain expenditures from parent view. The room erupted. Parents demanded explanations. The treasurer slammed her laptop shut. The secretary stopped taking notes. The president accused the vice president of betrayal, her composure finally shattering. The meeting devolved into chaos as years of suppressed grievances found expression. Principal Matthews appeared in the doorway, drawn by the noise. She surveyed the scene with satisfaction before calling for calm. Parents slowly settled, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. The board's iron grip was loosening, and everyone could feel it. The president attempted to restore order, but her authority had evaporated. Parents who'd never dared question the board were now demanding answers. The treasurer reopened her laptop to show financial records, but parents pointed out discrepancies. The secretary tried to reference meeting minutes that conveniently omitted controversial decisions. I finally spoke, reminding everyone that the Morrison Foundation's grant was meant to benefit all students, not just a select few. The room fell silent as I outlined what I'd observed during my visits. Teachers spending personal funds, locked supplies, children excluded based on their parents' social status. Each point landed like a hammer blow. The president tried one last desperate move. She suggested that perhaps Lincoln Elementary wasn't ready for such a large grant. Maybe a smaller amount would be more appropriate. The treasurer quickly agreed. The secretary nodded enthusiastically. They were willing to sacrifice funding rather than lose control, but the parents weren't having it. Voices rose in protest. Their children deserved those resources. Teachers needed support. The school required updates and repairs. The board's willingness to forfeit the grant for personal power exposed their true priorities to everyone present. Catherine Fuller stood again. She revealed she was an accountant and offered to review the PTA's financial records pro bono. Other parents volunteered their professional skills. A coalition formed spontaneously, united by shared frustration and hope for change. The board members watched their carefully constructed kingdom crumbling. The meeting ended with parents demanding a special election for new board positions. The president tried to cite bylaws about term limits. The secretary searched frantically for procedural obstacles. The treasurer mentioned waiting periods and nomination requirements, but the community had awakened, and procedural delays wouldn't stop them. As parents filed out, many stopped to shake my hand or share their stories. The president and her remaining allies huddled in the corner, whispering furiously. The secretary made call after call. The treasurer typed with desperate intensity. They were planning something, but their options were dwindling. I found Emma's teacher, Mrs. Fuller, waiting in the hallway. She thanked me for what was happening, tears in her eyes. Other teachers had gathered, hope replacing the resignation I'd seen before. They shared more examples of the board's interference with education, each story strengthening my resolve. The president emerged from the conference room, her perfect composure restored. She approached with the treasurer and secretary flanking her. They wanted to discuss a compromise. Perhaps they'd been too rigid in their approach. Maybe some changes could be made. Their sudden flexibility fooled no one. I declined their offer and headed for the parking lot. They followed, voices growing more desperate. The president mentioned her connections in the education community. The treasurer hinted at influence with other foundations. The secretary suggested that reputations could be damaged by negative reports. Their threats were as empty as their promises. That afternoon, Emma came home with a smile I hadn't seen in days. Some classmates had invited her to join their science project. Their parents had apparently decided the PTA board's social hierarchies no longer mattered. Change was rippling through the school community, starting with the children, but the board wasn't finished. That evening, my phone rang constantly. Board members and their supporters called with alternating threats and bribes. The president left voicemails about considering Emma's future at the school. The treasurer sent emails with attached documents trying to justify their decisions. The secretary created a social media campaign painting me as an outsider disrupting their harmonious community. I documented everything, building a file that would accompany my report to the Morrison Foundation. Their desperate attempts to maintain control only strengthened the case for change. Each threat revealed their true nature. Every bribe exposed their corruption. The social media campaign backfired as parents shared their own experiences. Emma noticed my stress and asked if she'd caused problems by having me visit her school. I assured her she'd done nothing wrong, but her worry broke my heart. The board's willingness to hurt children to protect their power made my decision clear. Lincoln Elementary needed this grant, but more importantly, it needed new leadership. Late that night, I received an unexpected email. The vice president who'd exposed the hidden emails wanted to meet. She had more information about the board's activities, things that would ensure they could never hold positions of trust again. The rebellion within their ranks was spreading. I agreed to meet her the next morning before school. As I prepared for bed, I thought about Emma and all the other children whose education had been compromised by adult power games. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities. The battle for Lincoln Elementary's soul was entering its final phase. The next morning, I arrived at school 30 minutes early to meet the vice president. She waited by the empty playground, clutching a manila envelope and glancing nervously around. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept much either. When she saw me approaching, she thrust the envelope into my hands and started walking quickly toward the parking lot. Inside were bank statements, vendor invoices, and email chains dating back 2 years. The treasurer had been steering contracts to her sister's office supply company at triple the normal rates. The secretary's husband owned the catering service that charged $500 for PTA meeting refreshments. The president had been skimming from fundraiser proceeds, small amounts that added up to thousands over time. The vice president explained how she'd discovered the scheme when asked to sign off on suspicious invoices. She'd been collecting evidence quietly, afraid to speak up alone. Now, with the community awakening, she felt brave enough to act. She handed me a flash drive containing digital copies of everything before hurrying to her car. I tucked the evidence into my briefcase and headed inside. The main office buzzed with unusual activity for so early in the morning. Parents I'd never seen before filled out volunteer forms. Teachers gathered in small groups, discussing plans with newfound energy. The atmosphere had shifted overnight from resignation to determination. Principal Matthews waved me into her office. She'd received 17 emails from parents overnight, all demanding transparency in PTA operations. 3 teachers had submitted grant proposals they'd been sitting on for years. The librarian had started cataloging exactly what resources were needed. The school was mobilizing. The PTA president arrived with the treasurer and secretary, their usual designer outfits replaced with more modest clothing. They'd clearly strategized overnight about image rehabilitation. The president carried a box of donuts, offering them to anyone who passed. The treasurer smiled at every parent she encountered. The secretary complimented teachers on their work. Their charm offensive fooled no one. Parents accepted the donuts but kept walking. Teachers nodded politely but didn't engage. The board members found themselves increasingly isolated in their attempts at damage control. Their kingdom was crumbling faster than they could shore up the walls. During morning drop-off, I noticed Emma walking with a group of classmates instead of alone. Their parents had clearly talked to them about inclusion. She waved at me with genuine happiness before disappearing inside. The sight lifted weight from my shoulders I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Catherine Fuller, being an accountant who just happens to volunteer for a financial review, feels awfully convenient, doesn't it? The vice president carrying around evidence for 2 years makes me wonder why she picked this exact moment to share everything. The president intercepted me near the library, her smile brittle as glass. She suggested we could work together on the grant application, positioning it as a partnership. The treasurer appeared with mock-ups of how the money could be distributed. The secretary had prepared a timeline showing immediate implementation. Their desperation was palpable. I walked past them into the library where Mrs. Garcia was teaching kindergartners about butterflies. The children sat mesmerized as she read from a tattered book held together with tape. The president followed, whispering about the new books they could buy. The treasurer calculated reading program improvements. The secretary took photos for their files. Catherine Fuller found me during her volunteer shift, accompanied by 5 other parents. They'd spent the evening reviewing publicly available PTA documents and found numerous discrepancies: purchase orders that didn't match receipts, fundraiser totals that didn't add up, meeting minutes that contradicted each other. They wanted to present their findings at the next board meeting. The president overheard and immediately called an impromptu board meeting for that afternoon. She claimed they needed to address parent concerns promptly. The treasurer sent emails about transparency and accountability. The secretary posted on the school's social media about their commitment to communication. Their sudden openness felt like a trap. I visited more classrooms throughout the morning. In 3rd grade, students shared textbooks because there weren't enough copies. In 4th grade, the science experiment was modified because supplies were locked away. In 5th grade, computers crashed repeatedly during research projects. Each observation added weight to my eventual recommendation. The treasurer cornered me outside the music room with her laptop. She'd created new budget projections showing how they could stretch the grant money. Her calculations assumed volunteer labor and donated materials. When I pointed out the unrealistic assumptions, she quickly revised the numbers. The desperation in her voice grew with each revision. Lunchtime brought another orchestrated show of support. PTA board members stationed themselves in the cafeteria, helping lunch staff and wiping tables. The president opened juice boxes for kindergartners. The treasurer helped a child who dropped his tray. The secretary distributed napkins with exaggerated friendliness. Their performance convinced no one. Emma sat with a full table of classmates, their chatter and laughter carrying across the cafeteria. One girl shared her cookies with Emma, who reciprocated with her apple slices. The natural kindness of children stood in stark contrast to their parents' manipulations. I watched from the doorway, not wanting to interrupt their normalcy. After lunch, the president announced the emergency board meeting would be open to all parents. She positioned it as a new era of transparency. The treasurer prepared financial presentations. The secretary arranged chairs in the gymnasium to accommodate the expected crowd. They were gambling everything on one last show. Teachers approached me throughout the day with quiet thanks and specific needs. Mrs. Fuller needed math manipulatives for hands-on learning. Mr. Rodriguez required updated software for his special education students. The PE teacher dreamed of equipment that wasn't held together with duct tape. Their requests were modest and focused entirely on students. The afternoon board meeting packed the gymnasium. Parents filled every seat and lined the walls. The president stood at a podium they'd somehow procured, looking every inch the concerned leader. The treasurer had connected her laptop to a large screen. The secretary distributed agendas with carefully worded items. The president opened with an apology for any miscommunication about their dedication to all families. She spoke about challenges and opportunities, using corporate buzzwords that said nothing concrete. The treasurer presented budget slides that obscured more than they revealed. The secretary read positive testimonials from carefully selected parents. Catherine Fuller raised her hand during the question period. She asked specific questions about discrepancies her group had found. The president deflected with promises of future audits. The treasurer mentioned accounting complexities. The secretary suggested forming a review committee. Their non-answers frustrated the crowd. More parents stood with questions. Why were supplies locked away? How were vendors selected? Where did fundraiser money actually go? The board members' responses grew increasingly flustered. The treasurer's laptop froze mid-presentation. The secretary shuffled papers frantically. The president's smile became a grimace. I remained silent in the back, letting the community drive the conversation. Parents who'd never spoken publicly found their voices. Teachers felt emboldened to share their experiences. The carefully controlled narrative the board had maintained for years unraveled thread by thread. The vice president stood again, this time with printed copies of the evidence she'd shared with me. She distributed them to nearby parents, who gasped at what they read. The president tried to grab the papers, claiming they were confidential. The treasurer threatened legal action. The secretary called for security that didn't exist. Principal Matthews took the microphone, her authority cutting through the chaos. She announced that given the serious concerns raised, the district would be conducting a full audit of PTA finances. The president's face went white. The treasurer closed her laptop with shaking hands. The secretary sank into her chair. Parents began calling for immediate board elections. The groundswell of voices grew until it echoed off the gymnasium walls. The president tried to cite bylaws about proper procedures. The treasurer mentioned notification requirements. The secretary pulled out a binder of regulations, but the community had moved beyond their procedural stalling. A father who was also a lawyer stood and explained that emergency elections were permitted under specific circumstances. Financial mismanagement certainly qualified. Other parents with legal knowledge confirmed his interpretation. The board members looked at each other with growing panic as their last defenses crumbled. The meeting ended with a vote to hold special elections in 2 weeks. The current board would be suspended pending the audit results. Parent volunteers would manage essential functions in the interim. The president left without a word, her heels clicking rapidly on the gymnasium floor. The treasurer and secretary scurried after her. Emma's class was dismissing as I left the gymnasium. She ran to me with artwork from that day, a butterfly with colorful wings made from tissue paper. Her teacher had found supplies in her personal closet to make the project possible. Emma's pride in her creation made my throat tight. Other parents approached as we walked to the car. They thanked me for being the catalyst, though the real work had been theirs. They exchanged contact information, forming committees and planning meetings. The PTA would be rebuilt from the ground up by people who actually cared about all children. That evening, my phone stayed remarkably quiet. No threatening calls or manipulative emails. The board members had retreated to deal with their own problems. The secretary's husband's catering contracts would be scrutinized. The treasurer's sister's supply company would lose its inflated deals. The president's skimming would be exposed. Emma chatted happily during dinner about her day. Her classmates had included her in playground games. She'd been picked for a group project. The teacher had praised her creativity. Normal childhood experiences that had been denied by adult prejudices were returning. I spent the evening writing my recommendation for the Morrison Foundation. Lincoln Elementary would receive the full grant, but with stipulations about financial oversight and community involvement. The money would flow directly to classrooms and teachers, bypassing the bureaucracy that had strangled progress for years. Principal Matthews called to share that several board members had already withdrawn their children from leadership positions in various school activities. Their influence was evaporating as parents refused to enable their behavior anymore. The special election would bring in new leadership committed to actual education rather than social hierarchies. Emma fell asleep easily that night, no longer worried about fitting in or having the right lunchbox. I sat at her bedside, watching her peaceful face and thinking about how close she'd come to being permanently damaged by adult power games. The grant money would help, but the real victory was the community finding its voice. The next morning brought news that the treasurer had resigned from the board, citing personal reasons. The secretary followed suit by lunch. Only the president remained, clinging to her position despite having no allies left. Her isolation was complete, a kingdom of one in an empty conference room. I submitted my report to the Morrison Foundation that afternoon, recommending full funding with the new oversight measures. The grant would transform Lincoln Elementary, but more importantly, it had already transformed the community. Parents who'd been silenced found courage. Teachers who'd been ignored found support. Children who'd been excluded found acceptance. 2 weeks later, the special election brought in a diverse board of parents committed to transparency and inclusion. Catherine Fuller became the new treasurer, bringing her accounting expertise to restore financial credibility. Other parents with various skills filled the remaining positions. The president didn't even attend the election. Emma's school experience transformed completely. Plot twist. The board members discovered that running away from problems works great until you run straight into consequences. Who could have predicted that actual evidence beats fake smiles every time? Her lunches in Ziploc bags were no longer photographed and mocked. Her mismatched socks became a trend other kids copied. Her gas station honey buns were traded enthusiastically. Children learned inclusion from parents who finally modeled it. The grant money began flowing to classrooms within a month. New computers replaced the ancient machines. The library filled with current books. Science equipment arrived in boxes that teachers opened like Christmas presents. The locked supply closet was emptied, its contents distributed to whoever needed them. I continued my work with the Morrison Foundation, visiting other schools and evaluating their needs. But Lincoln Elementary remained special, a reminder of what happened when communities stood up to those who would hijack resources meant for children. Emma thrived in the improved environment. Her natural kindness no longer a liability, but an asset. The former board members faded from school life entirely. The president moved her children to private school. The treasurer found other social circles to dominate. The secretary channeled her organizational skills elsewhere. Their reign had ended not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet irrelevance. 6 months later, Lincoln Elementary's test scores had improved dramatically. Teacher retention reached an all-time high. Parent involvement increased across all demographics. The school became a model for what happened when resources reached their intended recipients instead of being diverted by personal agendas. Emma and I still laugh about the day those women discovered who I really was. She's proud that her dad helped make her school better for everyone. I'm proud that she maintained her kindness despite attempts to make her feel inferior. The mismatched socks remain her signature style, a small rebellion against conformity that makes me smile every morning. Well, that was definitely quite the journey. Appreciate you letting me tag along and wonder about it all with you. Until we meet again, like the video, it helps more than you think.